If evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not evil, nor goodness good. On the contrary, both are suspended moments. Evil in general is self-centered being for self, and goodness is what is simple and without a self. When thus expressed in terms of their notion, their unity is at once evident. For self-centered being for self is simple knowing, and simple being that lacks a self is equally pure self-centered being for self. If, therefore, it must be said that according to this, their notion, good and evil, insofar as they are not good and evil, are the same, it must also no less emphatically be asserted that they are not the same, but are utterly different. For simple being for self, or pure knowing too, is each in its own self equally pure negativity or absolute difference. The whole is only complete when the two propositions are made together, and when the first is asserted and maintained, it must be countered by clinging to the other with invincible stubbornness. Since both are equally right, they are both equally wrong, and the mistake consists in taking such abstract forms as the same and not the same, identity and non-identity, to be something true, fixed, and actual, and in resting on them. Neither the one nor the other has truth. The truth is just their movement, in which simple sameness is an abstraction and hence absolute difference. But this difference in itself is distinguished from itself and is therefore self-sameness. This is precisely the case with the self-sameness of the divine being and nature in general, and human nature in particular. The former is nature insofar as it is not essential being, and the latter is divine according to its essence. But it is spirit in which the truth of these two abstract sides is made explicit, that is, by reducing them to suspended moments, an explication which cannot be expressed by the judgment, and the lifeless is, which forms its cupola. Similarly, nature is nothing apart from its essence, but this same nothing just as much is. It is an absolute abstraction, and thus pure thought or being within self, and with the moment of its antithesis to the spiritual unity, it is evil. The difficulty that is found in these notions stems solely from clinging to the is and forgetting the thinking of the notions in which the moments just as much are as they are not, are only the movement which is spirit. It is this spiritual unity, or the unity in which the differences are present only as moments or as suspended, which has become explicit for the picture-thinking consciousness in that reconciliation spoken of above. And since this unity is the universality of self-consciousness, self-consciousness has ceased to think in pictures. The movement has returned into self-consciousness. We pick up now with the second part of paragraph 780, much too long to try to compress the commentary into just half an hour, so split into two sections, but we're going to pick it up at the joining point between the two parts of this, in the English translation, 2-page paragraph. And so Hegel says, going back a little bit, in this picture thought there is depicted the reconciliation of divine being with its other in general, and specifically with the thought of it, evil. So we're going to be looking at the possibility of what reconciliation actually involves. And then he says, if this reconciliation is notionally expressed by saying that it consists in the fact that evil is in itself the same as goodness, or again, that the divine being is the same as nature. So we're going to come to that divine being and nature at the end. So it's very important that we realize that there's a kind of mapping going on between evil and goodness on the one side, and divinity and nature, and indeed human nature, or das Menschliches, right? A little bit later on in this paragraph. That's going to get us to the point of why this good and evil stuff actually matters at this point. So he goes on and he says that, this is an unspiritual way of talking, one that's going to give rise to misunderstandings or to an error or a mistake, an Unrecht, as we're going to see in just a little bit. And then here's where we're actually picking up in terms of the reading. if evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not goodness, nor goodness good. So what is Hegel actually saying there? I mean, first let's actually look at the formulation. If evil is the same as goodness, well, not precisely what the German says. If evil, das Böse, dasselbe ist, so is the same, was das Gute, right? So if it literally is the same thing as the good, which gives us now three terms, doesn't it? We don't have a simple equal sign, right? A Gleichheit between evil and goodness. Instead, it's sort of like commutativity, right? If evil is the same as what goodness is, then the two of them are the same. That's what Hegel's actually saying here. And so we want to think about where does this missing third term go? And we're going to see it, coming back in sooner than later. And so he says, following this, on the contrary, both are suspended moments. Now, Miller is using this suspended moments twice, I think only twice in this. And each time, suspended moments, it's not a very literal translation because what he's saying there is that they are aufgehoben. So Aufhebung, right? This very complicated Hegelian term that has so much meaning and resonance and plays a massive role within the dialectical movement and building. That is what's happening to good and evil. That's also what's happening to divine being, divine, divinity as such, and to the world of nature, which includes us human beings insofar as we are natural beings, right? So these are suspended moments, good and evil. And what does that mean? Well, he goes on and he says, okay, evil in general is self-centered being for self. Goodness is what is simple and without a self. And then he says, when thus expressed in terms of their notion, their unity is at once evident. So we're going to come back to that in just a moment. What does it mean to talk about this unity? But first, let's look at the two sides. So self-centered being for self. Once again, we see this in sich seiende, right? Rather than an sich, we have in sich. So self-centered is, a fine translation of that. We've had previously going into the self, right? So in sich gehende. And now we have für sich sein. The für sich sein, okay, there's consciousness there, or self-consciousness, an awareness of oneself or of what one is doing as evil. Now notice how he construes goodness here. Goodness, we could say, well, evil is more complicated than just this by its very nature. But the good, what is simple and without a self, selbstlose einfachen, right? So that einfachen is the simple. Selbstlose, no self on the side of the good. So being selfless. Now, we often talk about actions as being good actions when they are not primarily centered on the self. There's an entire tradition of this within German idealism. Think about Kant, think about other thinkers. We could even go back further. It doesn't just have to be a German idealist thing. It's a contrast between egoism and altruism in the British and the continental writers prior to Kant as well. This is kind of a framework, right? But to lack a self, and we've seen this back in the morality section, to be selfless because you don't actually have a self is not to be selfless in any sort of deliberate or decisional or committed way. It's just doing what you do, right? In a certain way, we could say that our very rudimentary artificial intelligences of the present are selfless in that they aren't programmed to be self-conscious, to take awareness of their environment or damage that can happen to them, to have emotional comportment or anything along those lines that are self-focused or self-regarding, right? So if goodness is that, of course it's not goodness. I mean, it's just isness, you could say, right? And if that's going to be contrasted to evil, if goodness disappears, then maybe evil disappears as well. So he goes on and he says, when we express them in terms of their notion, and here we have to be careful, right? So express ausgesagt, right? According to their notion, well, ihre Begriffe, right? So could be plural, according to their notions, or it could be according to their notion. When these are expressed according to their notion, Hegel says, then their unity is at once self-evident. Why? Self-centered being for self is simple knowing. Okay, so that's another thing that we can say about this. Knowing not just in a purely theoretical sense, but also like knowing what one is. So, knowing that one is evil or bad, or, being too self-centered, focusing only on one's own needs and wants and ideas as opposed to the larger whole. So we've got one thing there. And then he says, simple being that lacks a self. Now this is where it gets really quite interesting, right? Simple being that lacks a self is equally pure self-centered being for self. So it's the same thing as what evil is. Well, how's that the case? We could imagine a couple things. Hegel doesn't spell this out here, but we could think about this as being a pretense. And so the person who is being completely selfless is really doing so because they get something out of it themselves. So it really is just another modality of being self-centered in sich seiende and being for self. Right? Or it could be that both of these are just sort of mechanistic responses to how things go on, every entity attempting to preserve its being. This is actually an interesting place to consider somebody who Hegel's not talking about here, but a lot of people who are into Hegel are big fans of, and that's Spinoza. I mean, if Spinoza is actually right, and I don't think that he is, in a certain way, there isn't any evil and there isn't any good, right? There's only our imaginations of that. And every mode, complex mode that is a human being is a self-centered being for self in this way, but in a trivial way, because it's not substance. It's not what really matters. So put that digression aside for a moment. Let's come back to this. He says that if, therefore, it must be said that according to their notion, so nach ihrer Begriffe, right? According to their notion, good and evil, insofar as they are not good and evil, are the same. And here's where we start getting into some, what we could call depiction of notional thinking. This is a very, very important section of the phenomenology. I mean, could Hegel have told us about this earlier? Yes, I think that would have been helpful. But he has, in various ways, talked about this earlier. So according to their notion, they are the same, dasselbe. They are also not the same, nicht dasselbe, right? And that means that they are different, verschieden, or you could say like separated, set aside, right? They are distinct is another way of translating it. So they are both the same and not the same, but utterly different. And then he says, for simple being for self, or pure knowing too, is each in its own self. So now we're getting to see something on both sides, what's really there. Not just how we have been, let the cat out of the bag. Not just how we've been representing it, right? Presenting it to ourselves, thinking it through representation, through Vorstellung. That's an inadequate way of grasping these dialectical matters, according to Hegel. But if we really think it through, we realize that on both sides, the evil and the good, what we actually have is pure negativity, reine Negativität, right? Or absolute difference. Not just absolute difference between them, within them. And then he says something else really, really interesting, which again, Miller translates in a way that might be a little bit misleading. So what Miller says is the whole is complete when the two propositions are made together. And the German is erst diese beide Sätze propositions, vollenden das Ganze. So das Ganze is the totality, the whole, right, that we were looking at. What, if these are suspended moments, what are they suspended in? What are they suspended by? That's what we're asking here. Both of these propositions complete the whole. So it's not just that the whole becomes complete. It's not that the whole is complete if this happens to be the case. These two propositions being placed together by something that exceeds both of these propositions is what, in this case, fulfills, brings to its fruition, completes, perfects is another way of translating it, the whole, the totality. At least this totality, right? We're not at the ultimate totality yet, but we're getting closer. So he goes on and he says, the whole is only complete when the two propositions are made together. When the first is asserted and maintained, what is the first? That these are the same, right? When the first is asserted and maintained, it must be countered by clinging to the other with invincible stubbornness. Usually stubbornness is not a good thing, obstinacy, right? In this case, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to cling to both of these and say we're not going to, just because we're happy with saying that they're the same, we're going to forget about them being different. Or if we're going to insist on the difference, we're not going to lose sight of the sameness. We need to think both at the same time. Representational thinking is not really adequate to that. It wants us to go one way or the other. This is what in other places, for example, Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, he will call a philosophy of the understanding, of the Verstand, as opposed to dialectical or conceptual or however you want to put it, philosophy that he's actually aiming at. And so previous philosophies have generally got this wrong. And then he says, since both are equally recht, right? They both have rightness. They are both equally wrong, unrecht. And then he says the mistake. Now, the mistake is itself unrecht, right? So it's not as if there's right and wrong, and then there's a third thing over them that's a mistake of not grasping this. No, the wrongness of which we might attribute to either of the one-sided things, right? The propositions in this case of equality or difference, or sameness and difference. We are making a wrongness, a unrecht, right? An unrightness. That's what a mistake here is. So it's more than just like, oops, I made a little mistake, or I spilled some coffee or something. No, you're getting things fundamentally wrong in doing this, leading you in the wrong way. So he says, what is this mistake? Taking such abstract forms. And here he gives us two sets of examples. What are the abstract forms? Taking same, not same, or same and different, or identity and non-identity as being what? Something, etwas, something true, wahres, something fixed, festes, something actual, wirkliches. These are the things that we're trying to seek out through philosophy. I mean, Hegelian philosophy, let's pause on this for a moment. I like that these are kind of connected with each other because one of the things that we see throughout the dialectic, we've seen this term Wirklichkeit coming up over and over and over again. Hegel is interested in reality, actuality, Wirklichkeit, right? An idea is true. It finds its truth, its Wahrheit, its condition of being wahr, when it is made actual. And when you do that, you generally find out that it's kind of true and kind of false. It's more complicated, right? You understand that conceptually. Fixed. Now, this is another really interesting point, right? It is tempting to say, well, for Hegel, nothing is ever fixed. And that's kind of true, but things are definitely fixed within the scope of the dialectic and in history for a while, aren't they? Otherwise, it would be pure Heraclitean flux, or as James says, booming, buzzing confusion. You couldn't work with that. There has to be something that we actually do take as fixed, as true, as actual, even if we're mistakenly doing so for the time being. And that's what we do through Vorstellung, through representation, which, by the way, is not garbage, is not bad, is not awful. Hegel's not saying, throw it all away, proceed on to some mystical, intuitive insight. No, Hegel's not for that sort of thing at all. He wants something that is sort of like, Vorstellung without its lacks and impediments. That is what the concept is. Something you could actually explain to another person. So, the mistake is taking these abstractions as if they are true, fixed, and actual. And then he says, so the mistake is two-sided. It's you could call it doxastic or theoretical mistake. And then there's a practical side to it, resting on them. Auf ihnen zu beruhen. Beruhen, to rest. To rely upon, you could say, as if they are the way things genuinely are. And so he says, neither the one nor the other has truth. And what he means by that is not that they are completely false. That would be going to the other extreme. Rather, he says, the truth is just their movement, in which simple sameness is an abstraction and hence absolute difference. But this, as difference in itself, is distinguished from itself and therefore self-sameness. So we've got self-sameness, absolute difference, and these somehow have to be brought together in a complex, dynamic way. And so he says, now here's where we get to, as I mentioned, divine being. This is precisely the case with the self-sameness of the divine being and nature, Natur in general, überhaupt, and human nature, das Menschliches, in particular. So he says the former is nature. What's the former? Divine being. The former is nature insofar as it is not essential being. So God, goes out into nature. God doesn't just create, right, schaffen, right, nature, but God is, in a certain sense, within the totality of the world that we can experience, including the world that involves us. It's worth pausing here for a moment, too, to say, for Hegel, go back, think all the way back to the self-consciousness section in the beginning and the discussion of life. For Hegel, human beings being in the world makes the world a different world. It's no longer just nature. It is the domain of humanized nature, right? Which is a nature that can actually grasp the divine, whether the divine is something merely projected on our part or something that's outside of there, outside of the sphere of nature and transcendent to it, or a third thing that we're aiming at and going to reach in just a few paragraphs. So he says, the former is nature insofar as it's not essential being. The latter, what is the latter? Nature and human nature is divine according to its essence, its Wesen, right? What is important about it. So human being within the natural world is something that is already essential and the same as the divine in certain ways. Again, let's think back to all the other previous religion sections, right? The natural religion, and then the religion that's connected with artistic production and reception and drama and all that. That's what Hegel's talking about here. We can read this backwards, injected all of that into the world of nature as human beings without realizing that we were doing so, because this is the development of consciousness. So again, he goes and he says, it is spirit in which the truth of these two abstract sides is made explicit by reducing them to suspended moments. Once again, suspended moments, Aufgehobenes, by engaging in Aufhebung, right? By surpassing them, by transcending them, by canceling but keeping parts of them. And he says an explication which cannot be expressed by the judgment, the Urteil, right? And by the spiritless is, the lifeless is, which forms its copula, right? So this is quite important here. He says, similarly, nature is nothing apart from its existence, but the same nothing just as much is. It is an absolute abstraction and thus pure thought or being within self. And with a moment of its antithesis to the spiritual unity, it is evil, right? And now notice what he says after this. The difficulty that's found in these notions stems solely from what? Clinging to the is, clinging to an inadequate way of making sense out of being and the being that we are that can grasp that being. Sounds kind of Heideggerian, doesn't it? Hegel's doing this first. Because of this temptation of reducing the concept, the notion, to Vorstellung, to representation, and to the copula, to the is statement, to identity statements and predication and stuff like that. This is where we lose sight of things that he says. There's a forgetting that takes place here. He says, forgetting the thinking of the notions in which the moments just as much are as they are not. We need to think both and, right? We need to think identity and non-identity. We need to think sameness and difference. We need to essentially do philosophical thinking. I mean, this stuff about sameness and difference, this is not invented by Hegel. This goes all the way back to the time of Plato and actually even before that. But think about Plato's sophist, right? Where he's exploring these thoughts in considerable dialectic. This is very important for us, especially if we want to understand the divine and our connection to it. So he goes on and he says, forgetting the thinking of the notions in which the moments just as much are as they are not, are only the movement which is spirit. It is this spiritual unity, or the unity in which the differences are present only as moments or as suspended, which has become explicit for the picture-thinking consciousness in that reconciliation spoken of above. And since this unity is the universality of self-consciousness, self-consciousness has ceased to think in pictures. So it was doing Vorstellung, right? And it was thinking through Vorstellung, representation, picture thinking. And now it is realized within that sphere the inadequacy of picture thinking. That's not going to work for it anymore, right? And how is it going to proceed now? He says, the movement has returned into self-consciousness, right? What is that going to look like? Well, we'll see in the paragraph that follows. There's going to be something, it's actually not something completely new, it's been brought up before, but something new that is now becoming, let's say, clear and evident to those of us who've been following along the path of the dialectic and faithfully thinking along with Hegel as consciousness develops itself.